Yeah, welcome to Trump in the World. This lecture this week is on Trump and the rise of religious nationalism. My name is James Wellman. I'm the chair of Comparative Religion. I do a lot of work on religion in international studies, religion and violence, religion and human security, religion and US foreign policy. So very interested in this topic. In a sense, it is a disturbing one for me, at least, having known and understood American religion over a long period of time. The kind of white religious nationalism is not new in American history, but in one sense, we thought that we had kind of transcended that, especially with the election of Barack Obama. But it's come back in a more virulent fashion, which I suppose in some sense is a surprise to me, but maybe it shouldn't be. So we'll do this in three parts. I'll give you kind of the background on civil religion and the development of religious nationalism. And then I'll talk about a little bit how that relates to the United States. And then finally, studies on the rise of white religious nationalism with the election of Donald Trump. So, as I said, the background history, the crisis of religion, the development of global religious nationalism, then the presidency of Donald Trump. You know, Western culture from the 15th to the 16th, 17th century really has the beginnings of secularity, the differentiation of spheres, we might say. And then in the 15th, 16th, and 17th century, you get the development of the Enlightenment, the search for a rational basis for religion. And this really comes in response to the War of Religions in the 17th century, where a third of Europe is killed or murdered or dies because of war. And what you see is a rise, really, of figures in the Enlightenment who are seeking a more rational religion, or who are seeking the distinction between the secular and the religious, and really the attempt to overcome sectarianism, religious sectarianism, that is, and elevate a universal philosophy. And so you really see a cosmopolitan turn in religion. But this comes in waves, and there are waves going backwards as well, as we'll see. Secularity and the decline of religion has been written about extensively. And I think one of the best books that, if you're interested in this topic, is Charles Taylor, A Secular Age. It really is one of the great essays and books in this topic of secularization, and how secularization has really moved and transformed every level of society, and also how we think about the world. So differentiation is a key term when we're thinking about religion and the secular. Really, what that means is the freeing of the state and economy from religion. As most of you know, before the 15th century, before the 16th century, most states, most countries, most economies were deeply embedded in their religious worldview, in their religious forms. And so the West, in a certain sense, begins to push at that tie between religion and the state, religion and the marketplace, religion and politics, and seeks, in terms of the state, the emancipation of the secular spheres. That is with Hamilton and Jefferson. You see the growth of states which, instead of seeking the religion to sanction violence, they seek the state to sanction violence. And this is a big separation and really, in a sense, a revolution. In the economy, very powerfully, no longer does religion regulate the state and the economy, but government does. And so you get the development of different models and theories of utilitarian ethical models that seek not the state and religion's interest, but really seeks the interest of the most that can be covered in terms of the population. And then you get the rise of capitalism and really the commodification of resources. So resources are no longer dealt up in terms of religious groups or religious leaders, but in terms of the marketplace. The scientific revolution is even more extraordinary in the sense you get the seeds of the modern research university. You know, up until about 1900, most universities in America, most universities in the world were run by clerics of some kind or another. So the emancipation of these secular spheres of knowing and knowledge is really a powerful revolution. And this combines with the scientific revolution, of course, where everything is questioned and nothing is sacred. The sacred, in terms of religion, no longer determines and tells researchers what to study or what results to have in terms of their study. So you get the autonomy of methods of obtaining and verifying small t truth, okay? And really the development, of course, of the scientific method. In the 20th century, in the 21st century, you get a much different kind of modern research university, which is no longer tied to religions for the most part at all. So you get the different styles of political secularization. The marginalization of religion takes place in different ways. The French style, or what we call the laic style, develops a religion of humanity that is no longer controlled by the clerics or the clergy, Comte in France and Spencer in England. And you see different types of laicism in the Soviet and Chinese forms, where communism marginalizes through forms of Marxist thought any form of religion, but that too is transformed in the later part of the 20th century, as we'll see. In the US style, you get what is called a Judeo-Christian secularism, which is a sort of American exceptionalism. In the laic style, you get the French and European form. In the American style, or Judeo-Christian secularism, the American or British, it is an American civil religion. That is, God underwrites US freedoms. So the assumption is not that everyone's secular. The assumption is that most are religious, and yet this religious power underwrites the powers of freedom of speech, the freedom of study, the freedom to be what one is. So these are subtle differences, but they make some important, have powerful consequences on society. The laic secularism is an assertive secularism, influential in France, and influential, of course, in Russia, and in the past in Turkey, and of course in China, where religion is either kept private or in some forms is in some countries where religion is simply stamped out. Legal powers of the state used to discipline family and school, not religion, create secular governments and media, produce secular citizens, and keeping religion in the private realm. So really the state pursues no religious goals, no religiously defined goods. This is a radical form of what it means to be human, really. For most of our history as human beings, we've been controlled by religion in one form or another. And so this modernity really engages humans on a whole different level. In Judeo-Christian secularism, sort of the best examples of this are on the conservative side, George W. Bush, on the more liberal side, Barack Obama, but it really occurs in most US presidents. And that is there's a commitment to human rights. But this is based in part on this idea that every person, every man, woman on this earth bears the image of the maker of heaven and earth. That is this Christian assumption of secular rights. The US is empowered by a transcendental authority, a secular republic that is realizing God's will. Now, a lot of you, I'm sure, have trouble with this, but to a great extent, even Barack Obama gives politics a moral basis, in part based on a Christian nationalist idea of what it means. And this would be called a kind of civic religion. And you know, I'm very much aware that the younger generation in our colleges these days is much less religious, like twice as secular as previous generations. So there's really a form of aggressive secularism that is building in American culture today, in part led by many of you, and a deep and growing suspicion of religion, which I totally understand. America is no longer an exception to the secularization of the modern world. Many scholars, many figures in the scholarly world have said that America is exceptional because it is so religious and yet so developed. But today, in this generation, in your generation, we're dealing with a much different type of relationship to the secular world. And that's in part why it's so difficult to deal with a president of this country, Donald Trump, who is so deeply religious, or at least appears to be so. So we'll get to that in the next lecture, and look forward to seeing you. Okay, welcome back. This is part 2 of religion and nationalism. You know, what I was suggesting in the earlier lecture is that transformation and really the revolution within religion as we know it today in our contemporary societies, and there really is a crisis of religion. Because religious nationalism and its growth around the world is significant. And I think we can talk about that a little bit more, but religious nationalism rejects pluralism and diversity, which constitute one of the defining characteristics of what we think of in our modern cosmopolitan world. And so in that sense, really disturbs what we think of as what is normal, I suppose, in a certain sense, in our cosmopolitan thinking, in our philosophies of what it means to be a nation. We see this within India and the BJP. We see it in Jewish extremism with various leaders who are basically wanting to sustain Israel's policy and politics based on their Jewish faith. We see it in the rise of Putin and his growing and strong relationship to Russian Orthodoxy, which is, of course, quite distant from the recent Soviet past. And we see it in the American Christian right, a growing insurgent force to protect Christian conservative nationalism, to make America great again. So these are all political regimes that are attaching themselves to conservative forms of their traditional religions to basically capture and concretize their political power. So it is disturbing, at least for me. Probably is for you. There's new elements in this familiar story. States adopting forms of what I called religious nationalism. And you might ask, why is this happening? What is this? And kind of as a scholar of religion and politics and culture, my kind of answer to that is that religion works as a very cohesive national story. And it's a story that people can relate to in simple terms and rally around those that feature, that symbol of power and force. Religion can be used to silence minority voices, and more or less by saying, "Hey, if you believe in this God, you don't have any right to believe in another God, or to be secular even." So religion can galvanize populations for much larger purposes. In a in a real sense, the history of the world is the history of leaders who have galvanized religion for their own purposes. Religions very easily can create in-groups and out-groups. And so really they can be used to monopolize power and to gain groups loyalty. And then religion can also create minorities, or I'm sorry, create scapegoats. In a real way, the very powerful task of religion is to scapegoat, is to tell the true believer who is in the wrong, who is the outlier, who deserves to die, or who deserves to be sacrificed in some systems. So religion is a very powerful feature of legitimizing political power. And so a lot of people ask, why is religion becoming so important in people's lives? And I would argue, well, it always has been. And politicians and very powerful political leaders have always used religion to back them up and to help them to galvanize their support. I love this graph. This is something that we created over the last 5 years in thinking about religion and nationalism. You'll see this graph on the upper left, religious nationalism, where it is very powerful. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and now in Turkey. Religious nationalism is a growing phenomenon there. It's a growing phenomenon in India. It's growing in Russia, perhaps not as powerful yet, but certainly Putin knows how to use it. And in the US, it's really, this is a graph that we change all the time because states change all the time. But I think it is a powerful force in US politics now. And we'll see where it goes. Secular nationalism, we have China, North Korea, but that can be even argued, especially in North Korea, is that a kind of a religious kind of system that their president is pursuing? Who knows? But secular internationalism, I think, is very well developed, and as an ideal type, you could think of France and Germany, and to some extent England in that same way. So this is just a graph that helps to really map how we think about the world and how we might envision these systems and how they work across time and across tradition and across history. So the thesis of this study, and the data comes from a national probability sample of Americans surveyed soon after the 2016 election, which shows an increasing adherence to this Christian nationalist ideology. And this becomes a robust predictor of voting for Trump, even after controlling for economic satisfaction, sexism, anti-Black prejudice, anti-Muslim refugee attitudes, anti-immigrant sentiments, as well as measures of religion, socio-demographics, political identity, and more generally, so what this is saying is this Christian nationalist ideology is a robust predictor of its own. and really becomes an independent variable in the reasons for supporting Trump. So these findings indicate that Christian national ideology correlated, though, with class-based, sexist, racist, ethnographic views, is not synonymous or reducible to this phenomena. In other words, there is a Christian nationalist ideology that is the causal variable for the reason for the support of Trump. This is in part why it makes it very interesting and very disturbing. So there's 5 predictors in these studies of support for Trump. Number 1, white working class economic anxieties. You can see this in many times in the support for Trump and his movements. There's also, second, a deep sense of misogyny, a worry that women are somehow getting ahead and taking power over men. There's an anti-Black prejudice, which seems to be kind of underlying much of the conservative movement that we've seen over 2 centuries, really 3-4 centuries. The fear of Islamic terrorism, which has always been and very powerful, especially over the last 20, 25 years, and a general xenophobia. These are all predictors of support for Trump. So it should come as no surprise to you that many of these ideas, many of Trump's policies relate to these various types of groups. Religion and nationalism, more generally, has roots really within the Hebrew Bible. That Israel was the chosen nation, that in some sense America is the new Israel. The myth of maintaining blood purity by conquest and ethnic separation from the impure. In parts of this movement, there is a deep distrust and really hatred for native populations, for the indigenous among us. Often explicitly evangelical, an importance of separation for the sake of the calling, what some see a calling to purity in Christ for the sake of the nation, often linked to racial separation. This is just a part of the heritage of American culture, the kind of racism towards people of color and the felt need for racial and ethnic exclusion. These Christian nationalism have certain symbolic boundaries. The conflation of religious identity, Christian and preferably Protestant, with a race, of course, Anglo-Saxon kind of derivatives, nativity born in the US, citizen, American, a political ideology that is social and fiscal conservative. There's a reason why they support Trump in that sense, because of his libertarian views on the economic sphere. This is what is called a comprehensive cultural framework by which loyalty is gained and presidential elections are fought. This is a very powerful way to understand this process and really understand why Trump won. An important caveat here. This Christian white nationalism includes many American evangelicals, but we know that half of all American evangelicals don't support Trump, nor do they espouse these white nationalist principles. So this isn't a purely evangelical movement by any means. I think that's critical. I have studied evangelicals. I've written books on that. They are not all Trump supporters. In fact, many are fervently against him. So it's important not to make too many generalizations when we come to some of these issues, and to really rely on studies that show exactly what percentage and who is doing this work. Trump at the Liberty University had this powerful speech, and if you can understand this white Christian nationalism, this speech makes a lot of sense. I'm not saying the speech makes sense, but within this symbolic worldview. It makes a lot of sense. He says, but we are going to protect Christianity. And if you look what's going on throughout the world, look at Syria, where if you're Christian, they're chopping heads off. You look at the different places in Christianity, it's under siege. I'm a Protestant, I'm very proud of it, Presbyterian to be exact, but I'm very proud of it, very proud of it. I got to protect, because bad things are happening, very bad things are happening, and I don't know what it is. We don't band together, maybe. Other religions, frankly, they're banding together and they're using it. And here we have, if you look at the country, it's got to be 70%, 75%. Some people say even more, the power we have. Somehow we have to unify, we have to band together. Our country has to do that around Christianity. Okay, my friends, this is white Christian nationalism, right? At its most potent, really at its core. And you wonder why Trump is been elected. Well, this appeals to 40%, 45% of our country. Trump is often seen as a prophet in this sense. Trump warned that the Johnson Amendment, restricting political speech by nonprofits, kept most Christian organizations from supporting their candidates. He suggests overturning the amendment, which prohibits nonprofit organizations from endorsing political candidates. You can really see why Trump is anxious to appeal to his Christian base, because these are his most fervent supporters. Trump Trump claims if Clinton elected, no longer a Christian nation. Eric Metaxas, who's become kind of the intellectual spokesperson, says that God will not hold us guiltless if we vote for Clinton. And that's in reference to particularly the issue of abortion, that white nationalist Christians think of really kind of as the supreme movement to overturn the right to have an abortion. The warning that the Supreme Court could keep abortion legal and religious freedom would disappear. So a lot of us wonder why Trump does and says and talks about the things he does. Well, this is why. Trump is our returning to glory. Trump's Christian nationalist also expressed as a kind of a particular eschatology for America's future. Eschatology is end times, but it also means the future. So really, in a sense, Trump is saying that he will lead America to its future glory. Okay. Returning to our glory, emphasizing how America was once a great nation, once a Christian nation, and it has been disintegrated under the influence of Barack Obama, of terrorism, of illegal immigration. There's a reason that he mentions Barack Obama. This is a racialist code. Trump's promise was to restore America to its past glory, a point he made clearly in the ubiquitous slogan emblazoned on his red hats. And that's what we see. And that's what we'll talk about in the next section, how to make America great again, according to this white Christian nationalism. Okay, welcome back to our third and final lecture on white Christian nationalism and its rise. You know, coming into this series and thinking about this lecture, I did a lot of reading, and this work on white Christian nationalism is relatively new. Two books have come out most recently. One is Andrew Whitehead's book, Taking America Back for God. And the other is Catherine Stewart's book, The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. You know, neither of these books paint a positive picture of our future. And in a way, I hate to leave on a sour note, but it is hard to look at what's happening in terms of Trump and the rise of white religious nationalism and not be somewhat sad and discouraged. But at the end of this lecture, I want to give you some hope for the future and some ideas about what can be done. So let's just begin. You know, what's been found, and this has been done by sociologists that I trust and that who are doing really good work, that 26% of Americans say America is and always has been a Christian nation. 32% say America once was a Christian nation, but it no longer is one. And in both cases, you know, really what we're dealing with is kind of mythological language. The truth is that the United States of America has never been a Christian nation per se. But the mythological hope is that if we can get back to a white national Christian nation again, then we can truly somehow get back to who we really are for the sake of our religion, for the sake of our God, etc. And so this is a powerfully, I would say, new push and movement within American culture and American politics. So in 2017, there was a Baylor survey, and this was done by Andrew Whitehead, who's a trusted colleague of mine, finding out that 29% of Americans agree that the federal government should declare the US a Christian nation. Now, the reason why that number is so shocking is that the genius of the United States of America is at its heart the separation of church and state, the separation of church and state. And for me, this has always been significant in the sense that religion, when combined with the state, almost automatically means the corruption of both the state and the religion. 2/3 of Americans either agree or mostly agree that God granted America a special role in human history. That is, there is something in the American people that believes that they have a special mission from God. This has been really nurtured in the American soul over the last 20, 25 years, especially within the American evangelical community. Parsing out these numbers, it comes out that 3 out of 5 Americans think of America as a Christian nation. As we know, this is a real distortion of what the founders had in mind. Most of our founders were deist and weren't even Christian, and in a sense founded the American experiment to get away from the identification of politics with religion. They knew that religion was powerful, and that's precisely why they didn't want it at the heart of their political lives. And so this sort of rethinking or rewriting of history by American religious Christians is in a sense shocking, but it also tells you something about what is wanted or what is desired in this group. And of course, on the other hand, in these surveys, it shows that 7% of the nation totally rejects the whole idea of a Christian nation. That is, there's a strong, very forceful, powerful minority group within the nation that is, rightfully so, really forcefully rejecting this whole idea of a Christian nation. And I would argue that the nation in its history is on their side. There's a sense in which the founders of our American experiment knew the power of religion, and some believed and were believing Christians. Most were deists, They believe that God created the world and it was up to us to put it together. And so there's no sense in which the American experiment was a Christian experiment per se. It was informed by the Christian faith, but not dominated by it. And so today we're in a situation where many, perhaps half of us in the American bloodstream, want to enforce some sort of Christian identity upon our nation. And that, I think, is a problem. Studies show a correlation between Christian nationalism, nativism, white supremacy, patriarchy, heteronormativity, and divine sanction for authoritarian control and militarism. We have to say that at the heart of this position is a troubling contribution of militarism, of religion, and of politics. And this Christian nationalism predicts voting for Donald Trump. So Trump has become sort of a symbol of this movement. And many of us, seeing that Donald Trump was running for presidency, doubted whether he even knew the basics of what the Christian religion was about. And yet he has become the leader of this Christian state movement. And of course, he's used it with a finesse and a salesmanship that has been, brilliant in a certain way. Trump has wide appeal. We find that Christian nationalists vote for Trump is not synonymous with, reducible to, phenomenal of any of other ideologies. So what we found is that this Christian nationalism is very much a part and parcel of what it means to support President Trump. So to kind of sum it up, Christian nationalism is a pervasive set of beliefs and ideals that merge American and Christian group memberships who view a Trump presidency as the defense of the country's perceived Christian heritage and a step toward a restoration of a distinctly Christian future. Christian nationalism provides a meta-narrative for a religiously distinct national identity, and Americans who embrace this narrative and perceive threats to that identity overwhelmingly vote for Trump. So what I want to say is that this is a phenomena and a very powerful one. And I would argue that this is a dangerous time in the history of our republic. And of course, Trump is just the messenger here. He is a tool, and in my mind, the messenger doesn't matter. It's a part that is being played, and of course, who's better to play it than an actor? So, in a certain sense, Trump is the right person for the right time for religious and national ideology that I think is dangerous to us all. Ironically, at the very time in which this combination of Trump as a leader and this Christian ideology were being formed, books were coming out predicting the end of white Christian America. Now, in terms of gross numbers, that the case is true that white Christians are now a minority in the country, right below 50%. But this news came out as if to say that this white Christian group had become less powerful, less pervasive, less influential in our politics. And the irony, of course, is that the opposite has been the case with the election of Donald Trump and the kind of coalescence of these two movements. This white Christian nationalism has become very powerful. And this white Christian nationalism is not reducible to our strictly defined by a particular demographic group or associated with a religious tradition or traditions. So in that sense, it's a powerful and influential narrative and goes beyond institutional religion. So here's my conclusions. 30 to 40% of Americans support some form of white Christian nationalism. And I think the data proves that point. Christian nationalism rejects pluralism. That is, does so intentionally, seeks to reject other forms of religion, other ethnicities, other sexualities, anything that's different. World religions are becoming nationalist the globe over, combining state and religion, rejecting minorities of any kind. We see this in India. We see this growing in Russia. We see it growing even in Turkey, that used to be a secular republic. Religious political leaders are using scapegoating of minorities to galvanize support. This is a tried and true method of ideological leaders, political leaders everywhere. Charismatic figures appeal to the darkest instincts, and it works. I think there's a sense for us that we thought this couldn't happen in America, and yet that's precisely what's happening. The world crises enabled our worst instincts. That is, the conflicts and the climate change and other issues have not brought our best out, but has brought out our worst. Okay, with that rather dark and difficult image of the future, I want to bring hope for the future. Our younger generation is less religious and less ideological. I think that is good news. Religion, I believe, typically has been a good as long as it's not connected to politics. Our newer generation, I believe, is less ideological. There's a declining white population, which promises more diversity, which allows the white community to realize its rightful place as a minority group, that it can't dominate anymore. Number three, we need to create faith systems that are more cosmopolitan. I'm not one to give up on religion. I study religion. I study the best in religion. I also study the problems, but I study what is best in religion. And there are many good things that come out of religious systems when they are more cosmopolitan oriented. Number four, support the separation of church and state. At the heart of the American experiment is that separation. Religion is a good when it's in its place. When it's at the heart of the state, it always and usually becomes destructive and devilish. Vote for parties that are savvy on religion and culture. I'm not one who is negative on religion. This isn't an anti-religion lecture, but religion can be very good, but it can also fall to temptation. Elect leaders who bring people together. Stop the scapegoating. Stop the scapegoating. Stop the scapegoating of minority groups. Stop the scapegoating of religion. Stop the scapegoating of anyone. Nurture leaders who appeal to our most inclusive instincts, who don't need to disrespect religion, who don't need to disrespect those who are secular. Hope for a generation, for me, that is passionately inclusive. More now than ever, we need cosmopolitan, inclusive leaders who understand difference, who can nurture people who are different than them, who can appeal to our best instincts. And I hope that is our future. And I really hope the best for your future as well.